didn't get an audience as many as this. I suspect you've come to hear about horse racing because of the fundraising difficulties. I've entitled this talk From Sport to Business, the first 75 years of horse racing in South Australia. And it divides very nicely into three 25-year periods. The first one I've called external emulation, where I think all the time South Australia is looking back to what was happening in England. The second period, from 1863 to 1888, I've called internal rivalry, for reasons which will become apparent a bit later. And the third period, from 1888 to 1912, I've called the Great Revival, because that's when I see horse racing in South Australia taking on the image of industry, certainly becoming relatively big business for the time. First of all, then, the first 25 years. Certainly up to the early 1860s, racing in South Australia owed much to the traditions of the turf in England. As John Daly, sitting there, that's $5 for the plug, John, in his recent book has shown quite well that in the efforts to establish a new Britannia in the Antipodes, the South Australian colonists pursued many of the sporting habits of the mother country. Horse racing was seen as part of England's social fabric, so it was soon organised in the new colony. In fact, the first meeting was on New Year's Day 1838, scarcely a year after proclamation. And about 800 people attended this meeting. Now, depending on what estimate you take, that's somewhere between 25 and 40% of Adelaide's population going to witness the 3 matches, 1 sweepstake race, all of them running heats. And I think the Jockey Club would be quite pleased if 25 to 40% of the Adelaide population turned up these days. I think despite the very un-Englishness of a blazing sun, that is very un-English, the dusty paddock, the slab huts, the meeting was clearly seen as a link with home thousands of miles away. The format of racing was exactly the same as you would find in the, not so much the major meetings in England, but at the typical meetings in England at the time. And for the next 2 decades or so, South Australian racing, both metropolitan and country, continued to exhibit many of the characteristics of the English sport in its traditional form. Now, if you want to find out about the traditional form, there's a very good book on the history of English horse racing, which modesty prevails me telling you the author of it. Basically, races were once-a-year holiday events. Events designed to provide some organised sport as the focal point of the community's relaxation. Horse racing was but one ingredient of a day of enjoyment. Spectators didn't come just to see the horse races. They came for what we might call all the fun of the fair. There'd be entertainers, beer tents, foot races, many other entertainments going on at the same time as the racing. As in England, it was organised on behalf of local notables. Men who organised racing primarily so their own horses could race, but also because they could use sponsorship and patronage to cement their position in the local social hierarchy. The structure of the racing was somewhat different, however, from the English situation. The typical race would be a 1.5 to 2 mile handicap heat, and I'll explain what all that means in a minute. But races were organised for horses of any age and parentage. There would be a variety of events including hurdle and match races. Now, this structure was dictated by the limited supply of quality racehorses in the colony. And this was a major problem that racing enthusiasts in South Australia had to overcome. And the way they got round this then was by this particular structure of racing. Firstly, they had heats. Now, a heat meant that the horses had to race more than once. The race wasn't won until one horse had won the race at least twice. So say you managed to get 6 horses in a race, theoretically you could have 11 races before a winner, 7 races before a winner was declared. So heats guaranteed you at least 2 races for the price of one, and possibly several more. Hack races. Races specifically then for riding hacks meant that you could have races which allowed non-thoroughbred horses to compete. Hurdle races enabled, or brought in the hunters, enabled another type of horse to have a go. Then you would have on the day consolation races for all the horses that had lost, or what were called hurry-scurry races, where you just announced at a point in time, does anybody want to race? And of course many of the people would have come to the race meeting on horseback and they would just join in. Match races, where one owner would simply challenge another owner, a head-to-head contest in effect. All these then, the consolations, the hurry-scurries and the match races, help stretch out the racing programme. And then you brought in all-age events, so that 2-year-olds could race against 6-year-olds. Means again you got more races out of a fixed quantity of horses, but more especially you made them handicaps, so the 2-year-old had a reasonable chance of beating the 3-year-old or the 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, etc. And of course handicaps made for exciting gambling as well. Theoretically every horse should have an equal chance in a handicap race. And I think the all-age aspect and the handicap aspect made races out of what otherwise might have been one-sided 2-horse processions. Now, nevertheless, despite all these expedients, the absolute shortage of horses meant that the largest field on average throughout the 1850 season that I've been able to trace was only 4 runners. Right? That was the largest field on any given day at a meeting. By 1860, however, imports and the establishment of studs had shifted the norm to between 6 and 8. I suppose that means 7, doesn't it? Major problem then, the shortage of quality racehorses. Second problem to be faced was that of prize money. Matches were fairly straightforward. It was simply one owner wagering against another owner. Sweepstakes too, where owners would put in say 2 or 3 guineas and the winner would take the lot, are an extended form of match. But some money added to that sweepstake was considered necessary to tempt racehorse owners to participate, particularly if they had to travel some distance to a race meeting. Now it seems to me from the economic history of South Australia that resources in the colony at this time were insufficient to have financed prize money for regular race meetings. In other words, you are limited practically to the annual event or the maybe 2 meetings a year in a given place. Now, where did this money come from? Firstly, from local dignitaries and politicians. Name the race after somebody, they'd be willing to give you a bit of money. Something, of course, that's catching on with the sponsors fairly recently. Secondly, subscription lists would be taken to those who stood to benefit financially from the meeting. And as early as 1851, it was argued in the local press, and it's a long quote I'm afraid, but no man of business, being merchant or tailor, can deny that our metropolitan races are of very great importance to the trading community. The attraction which they present to the country settlers causes such an influx of visitors with money that our shopkeepers must reap considerable benefit from their multifarious wants and indulgences. Hence, you went round with the cap, and publicans would sponsor plates, butchers would sponsor cups, and you get a variety of purses from a variety of local tradesmen. Third source of funds were booth rents, or tent rents, I suppose we should call them. rents paid by the proprietors of the refreshment booths and the beer tents, and also by those who erected temporary grandstands for the duration of the meeting. You put up scaffolding, put a few planks on, and charge people to sit up a bit higher than the hoi polloi. Point out, of course, that I think the 1850 New Year Day meeting is the famous one where the grandstand collapses and all the social nobility of Adelaide are cast among the populace. Really just demonstrates, I suppose, that some stands were more temporary than others. The point to emphasise, though, is that, as in Britain at this time, no funds whatsoever were raised directly from the general public. There was no gate money to be paid. Unless they wished to use the grandstand, and I think you'll agree that I think it was 3 shillings and 6pence was an effective social barrier to use of the grandstand. Unless they wanted to use the stands, entry to the races at this time was free. Now, one reason for this, I think, was it was easy enough to restrict access to the grandstands. 2 blokes, 6 foot tall and 12 foot wide, stand there, can control anybody. You couldn't do that for the race course as a whole. Firstly, you would have had to have much wider enclosure, much more fencing involved, and this would have been very costly. And there's no guarantee when you've got one race meeting a year that your returns would justify such an outlay. So I think the economic circumstances of the time prevent you charging gate money. It's just not a viable economic proposition, given the costs that would have to be involved to get a return. So, 2 major problems to be faced then: the shortage of good quality horses, the level of prize money that could be offered. The third problem was a dual one. This was some form of central control of South Australian racing, and associated with that a permanent course for metropolitan events. In August 1838 you got a turf club formed with the aim of what it said was encouraging racing and field sports. We know very little about this except that it faded from the scene sometime in the 1840s, but it does not seem to have been any power in South Australian racing. It's not until 1849 that you get the first South Australian Jockey Club, and this was abandoned 6 years later in 1855. The reason for the abandonment, I think, is that they overstretched themselves financially. In the year that they folded, they added prize money of 535 sovereigns to the St. Leger meeting, which was a record for South Australia at the time. Now, I think they just overreached themselves financially and collapsed because they couldn't cope with their commitments. In 1856, 1 year later, a second jockey club is founded. This is no more permanent and is dissolved in 1861. So you have a problem then of no permanent central organisation of racing at this time. Though it seems to me that these early jockey clubs were not concerned with controlling racing. Their ambitions were limited to running an effective metropolitan meeting. If other clubs outside Adelaide itself wanted to use their jockey club rules, all well and good, they didn't mind that, but they didn't actively go out and try and force them on meetings elsewhere in South Australia. So adherence to jockey club rules then was voluntary, not compulsory at this time. I think a much more pressing problem was the metropolitan course. The annual meeting of the jockey club was switched to the, well, it's not the jockey club, it's the turf club at this time, sorry, was switched to the East Parklands in 1846. To what was known throughout the 19th century as the Old Course, and what became in the 1890s Victoria Park. But there were problems in obtaining a long-term lease for the course. Corporation allowed them to have an annual lease, but no longer. 2 problems from this. Firstly, there's no security for any improvements that were made to the course. If they put up a grandstand, they might lose it next year with the lease not being renewed. Nor could they keep the public off the course or its facilities. So even during a race meeting, people could walk across the track, dangerously but quite legally. Now in 1859, the South Australian Jockey Club leased land at Theberton. Possibly, I think, to get security of tenure there. They were guaranteed a long-term lease. Somewhat ironically, I think, alongside the course at the time was a boiling down works, which I think probably put the fear of glue into some unpromising nags coming up the final straight. It was not an ideal track. Entry to it was far too easy. It wasn't totally fenced up, and a notice was posted several times warning that any goats, pigs or poultry found on the course would be destroyed. Racing continued at the old course. The Jockey Club got itself into a financial bind. It ran its New Year's meeting at Theberton and its May meeting on the old course. Attempting to do this led to financial difficulties, and the club collapsed, as did the previous ones, for financial reasons, in 1861. The new Jockey Club that took over immediately attempted to obtain a parklands lease similar to that one that they could get at Theberton. It wasn't forthcoming, and from then on they concentrated all their racing at Theberton. This doesn't mean that the old course went out of existence. It was taken over by a man called Paddy Coghlan, who was owner of the Rapid Bay stud. So the situation then, towards the close of the first 25 years of horse racing in South Australia, is that there were two different organisers of metropolitan racing. And here I think we find that the seeds of future rivalry that were going to cause problems in the next 25 years had been sown. Second 25 years then I've termed internal rivalry. And this is rivalry within South Australia and between South Australia and the other states. We find that even when South Australian racing became more ambitious, it still tended to emulate English practice. Hence, in 1855, Adelaide witnessed its first St. Leger, and in 1860, its first South Australian Derby. They adopted the names of the English classics. But attitudes were changing. And an intercolonial rivalry, I think, came to the fore in 1864 with the establishment of South Australia's premier race, the Adelaide Cup. The Adelaide Cup was an all-age event, whereas the Derby and the St. Leger were specifically for 3-year-old horses. Given the shortage of horses in South Australia, the Adelaide Cup was a much more suitable major event, particularly from 1868, when it also became a handicap as well as all age. They stopped imitating, or they continued with the imitating the English classics, but they now brought in this event specifically suited to South Australian conditions. It came about, I suspect, as a reaction to the Melbourne Cup of 1861 and the Australian Cup of 1863. But possibly it was also stimulated by the transfer in 1863 of the famous Lockley stud to the more lucrative Victorian market. And I think round about now we find the sign of growing economic attitudes in South Australian racing. Indeed, the £1,050 of added money at the first Adelaide Cup meeting was lauded in the South Australian press as, quote, the first real and substantial inducement yet afforded to sportsmen here to exercise care in the breeding and training of their horses. So economic attitudes are beginning to make themselves felt. And money to be made from breeding increasingly became regarded as an important byproduct of South Australian horse racing. Exports of South Australian horses had gone up in the late 50s, had gone up even more in the early 60s, but then began to fall back. And this led to Parliament being persuaded in 1870 to revive the Queen's Plates. Now these were races where the winner got 100 sovereigns, but the winner was used for stud purposes throughout South Australia. It was an attempt to develop not sprinters, but horses that could run long distances carrying heavyweight jockeys. The idea being to breed horses suitable for army remounts and to breed half thoroughbreds for farm work. Right? They're not really looking to breed race horses from the Queen's Plates, but it's done via the racetrack with the subsidy for a particular type of race. Nevertheless, even with this revival, it wasn't until the late 1870s that the South Australian Jockey Club was able to abandon the use of heats at its meetings. So there's still a shortage of horses right into the 1870s. And even at that time, handicaps still dominate the race cards, and racers can still be found for hacks, though matches and hurry-scurries had pretty well disappeared by this time. Now, my evidence for all this is the stuff you see on the card table there. These are some of the old race cars that I salvaged out of the fire at Morphettville, well, 3 years ago now, I think. You'll also find a photograph there at the top which shows the state of the records when I did find them. All the shelves had burnt through, all this stuff was in a great mass of water at the bottom. There's about between 1 foot and 2 foot just of sodden paper that had to be dried out, and there some of the few things that could be rescued in decent form if you'd like to have a look at them later. So by the late 1870s then, to some extent, the problem of horse shortage is getting solved. Prize money in the 60s continues to come from traditional sources. The spectators still did not pay at the gate. And this meant that the race committees were unable to sustain the level of prize money that they had attempted. I said in 1864 the Adelaide Cup meeting had added money of £1,050. 4 years later it had fallen back to 630, about 60% of what it was. And again, I think fundraising difficulties were a major reason why there were still problems in establishing a permanent jockey club in South Australia. The one in 1861 that I mentioned continued to race at Theberton, but was wound up in 1869 with debts of over £800. The races at Theberton continued for a further year as a private speculation, but the prize money raised was inadequate to attract sufficient quality entries, and only 400 spectators attended. The fixture was abandoned, and the course was used as a site for the extension of the boiling down works. Coghlan and his associates fared only slightly better with the Queen's birthday meet in 1869 at the Old Course. They attracted 1,500 spectators. And then they packed in. So racing in South Australia in 1870 was at a low point. There was no jockey club, there was no Adelaide Cup, and there was only a couple of racing fixtures with relatively poor attendances compared to what they'd had 5 or 10 years earlier. And this was seen as a major blow to South Australia because, again quoting local newspaper, racing in the colonies had more of a business aspect than it had in the old country. The reason for this, I think, was the type of owner that went into racing in South Australia compared to England. In England, men really with princely fortunes offered special patronage to the sport by spending large amounts in breeding, training and racing their horses. To a great extent, this is not done for economic reasons, but I suspect as a hobby, as conspicuous consumption, something like that. Now, there were some wealthy owners in South Australia, but they were not wealthy by English standards. The richest South Australians would be well down the list of any list of wealthy people of the UK plus South Australia. The turf in South Australia really was seen as an auxiliary to the promotion of horse breeding. Few men raced without an eye to the market for the thoroughbred offspring. The test of the racetrack was used to select breeding stock. You bred from the horses that won races. Excuse me. Without the racecourse test as a seal of merit, then customers might simply go elsewhere, particularly to another state. And yet, from this nadir in 1870, the next decade and a half saw South Australian racing undergoing a remarkable period of boom and bust. It saw the foundation of 2 new metropolitan racing clubs, the creation of a new course of world standard, and the introduction of the totalisator. But it ended with the winding up of both racing clubs and racing practically non-existent in Adelaide. Now, the attempt to revive racing in South Australia began in July 1873 with the foundation of yet another jockey club. I think we're on to number 4 by now. This one adopted a much more business-like manner than its predecessors. For example, the traditional method of paying out the prize money was a big dinner, the settling dinner. This was abandoned in place of just turning up to the secretary's office, knocking on the door and asking for your money. The new jockey club immediately looked for a permanent racecourse, and to this end, now that Theberton had gone, of course, it negotiated with the Adelaide City Council for a long-term lease of the old course. It wanted to expand racing. It felt that 1 meeting a year was insufficient to, again quote the foundation rules of the jockey club, to prevent our most valuable sires and dams, together with their progeny, being sold and going to enrich neighbouring colonies whose large prizes were open to them for competition. In effect, they're saying there's not enough prize money in South Australian racing. We need more money and we need more racing. Now, in the meantime, while these negotiations with the City Council are going on, Sir Thomas Elder offered 160 acres of land for a racecourse at Morphettville. And he offered this to a newly formed and queerly named South Australian Jockey Club Company, which had nothing whatsoever to do with the South Australian Jockey Club. It's a totally separate enterprise with different people involved. Now, perhaps the Jockey Club regarded the choice of name of the company as somewhat of a challenge, and initial approaches for the Jockey Club to purchase shares in the company were rejected out of hand. And a ridiculous situation developed excuse me, where the Jockey Club had a racing club but no course of its own, and the Jockey Club Company had a course but no one to organise racing. If you read the Jockey Club minutes on this, and they're available at Morphettville, it's for a whole year they write to each other, they ignore each other's letters, then they write back 6 months later. It's all very complicated, but eventually the two do come to terms. But I think a fitting comment on what happened on the situation is that the first meeting scheduled for Morphettville had to be transferred to the old course because Morphettville was flooded. The reason it was flooded is that neither side in the debate would pay for the drainage. The Jockey Club continued to negotiate for the old course. Clearly they wanted a monopoly of metropolitan racing, but the Adelaide Corporation was not willing to allow this. And what developed at the old course then was the Adelaide Racing Club. And again then we've got the beginnings of intercompany rivalry. The South Australian Jockey Club at Morphettville, the Adelaide Racing Club in the Parklands. And the finances of racing were beginning to change. Morphettville was an enclosed course. Every racegoer had to pay for the racing now. The minimum pay, even for the flat, you had to pay a shilling. So the Jockey Club finances then, if they can attract the spectators, are on the up. They've not got this major problem of prize money that they had before. But the major fillip to the prize money came in 1879 with the legalisation of the totalisator. The way was open now for racing to dip its bucket in the financial stream flowing from gambling. Previously was restricted to charging a fee to bookmakers. Now they can get a percentage of the turnover on betting. The percentage they took, in fact, was 7.5% of turnover. Show how important this was. Turnover of the Metropolitan races in 1881 was 63,000 at the tote. In 1882 it was 97,000. It's going to solve a lot of financial problems then for the two major racing clubs. The major problem then was not finance but intercompany rivalry. The South Australian Jockey Club wanted a monopoly. I think a lot of the problem stems from them. The reason they want a monopoly is that Morphettville is still really regarded by many spectators as an out-of-town course. You've got to travel out of Adelaide, out towards Glenelg. Right? It's much easier to go to the race meeting in the parklands at the time. Intercompany rivalry, what problems did it lead to? It led to the deliberate clash of fixtures. Both of them having New Year's Day meetings. Both of them having Queen's Birthday meetings. In other words, halving the potential market all along the line. It led to stupid problems which are now in the race records forever, where in 1881 and 1882 both clubs claimed to run the South Australian St. Leger. So you've got two winners of the St. Leger in each year. Now there's one for your quizzes when you go to, who won the St. Leger in 1881? Give you the right answer, you get, no, it was the other horse. And it led, thirdly, to the South Australian Jockey Club declaring the Adelaide Racing Club meetings illegal because they were not run under South Australian Jockey Club rules but under Adelaide Racing Club rules. This led to a threat then of a dichotomy in South Australian racing. There would be a split between those owners and spectators that supported the Jockey Club and those owners and spectators that supported the Adelaide Racing Club. But all this came to nothing in the end because the anti-gambling brigade had remarshalled its forces and in 1882 began a fresh campaign against the totalisator. In 1883 they forced the repeal of the Totalisator Act. The racing clubs saw no point in continuing. Without the tote they could not maintain the level of prize money which they'd been offering. In 1879 the Adelaide Racing Club had offered prize money of £1,900. 3 years later, because of the tote, they offered prize money of £8,800. There's no way they could have maintained that level of prize money without the without the proportion of the turnover from the tote. Nor could they revert to the pre-1879 situation because bookmakers had also been declared illegal. So there were no bookmakers and there were no tote. Without gambling then, what was there to attract the general public to racing? And so both clubs folded. This leads to an interesting one. Another one of you could use in a quiz competition is, what horse won the Adelaide Cup but never saw South Australia? Now, it's nothing to do with the winner Lord Wilton wearing blinkers. It's because all the entries to the Adelaide Cup had been taken, and then racing in South Australia was abandoned. So the Adelaide Cup was run at Flemington in 1885. The losses to South Australia through the collapse of the racing industry have been estimated at the time of between £100,000 and £200,000. This is via emigration of people involved in the industry who wanted to continue, via the unemployment caused, by the loss in railway and steamer traffic, and by the declining corn sales to the trainers and breeding establishments. This would be approximately lowering the gross domestic product of South Australia by a whole percentage point. So it's not an insignificant amount. Well, thanks to the election of 1887, which cleared out many of the anti-tote personnel from Parliament, and thanks also, I think, to political lobbying by Sir John Baker, the tote was reinstituted in September 1888. And on that same day, yet another jockey club was founded. This one was permanent. And another Adelaide Racing Club followed immediately afterwards. The way was open then for racing to boom again. And as I think those figures show, it did boom, though not all plain sailing. There's two major influences I think occur. One is the state of the economy. Ownership was affected by fluctuations in the stock exchange and by pastoral activities. And tote revenue and gate money were affected basically by the state of metropolitan unemployment. The other influence, I think, was legislation affecting the tote, or further legislation affecting the tote. In 1893, on-course bookmakers are declared illegal, and this shoves a lot more money into the tote than before. And later legislation made tote agents illegal. Now, tote agents were the bookmakers. Bookmakers were made illegal, so they became agents to the tote, took people's money and put it on the tote for them, getting a 1.25% commission for doing so. They soon realised that this was a silly way to make money when they could keep it in their own pocket, and they set up what were called tote shops all over Adelaide. Now, legislation's passed saying the tote shops are illegal. They're not genuine clubs in the same way that, say, a sportsman's club would be. And when you check the membership list, it's dead obvious. I'm going to lecture here. I've got some figures in a paper. One club had a room 12 feet by 17 feet and claimed to have 800 members. Another had two rooms, each measuring 14 feet by 20 feet, and claimed a membership of over 1,000. There's no way they were genuine sportsmen's clubs, and so they got closed down. And this affects the amount of money, I think, that then came into the tote by the racetrack. The old problems of control, horses and prize money were all solved in this third 25-year period. With control, the new jockey club was permanent and was able to centralise its control over South Australian racing. In 1891, it decided to publish a racing calendar of registered events. To be registered, a race had to be run under South Australian Jockey Club rules. Otherwise, any horse owner, jockey trainer involved in unregistered racing was disqualified from official racing, not just in South Australia, but all over Australia. And also many international agreements were made that banned them from New Zealand and England and France. So you accepted Jockey Club authority or you got out of racing. That was the basic situation. The main challenge to the power of the Jockey Club came not from the Adelaide Racing Club, which accepted Jockey Club rule now, but from the Owners and Trainers Association of South Australia. The reason for this was that a third metropolitan course had been started at Port Adelaide, which raced at Cheltenham. The Port Adelaide Racing Club racing at Cheltenham. And the Jockey Club refused to allow Port Adelaide to race at Cheltenham on as many days as the tote legislation would have allowed them. After the Port Adelaide application had been rejected for 5 successive seasons, the Owners and Trainers Association took up Port Adelaide's case in 1901. They took up it very effectively. They applied to the Jockey Club. So the Jockey Club considered the case. The Jockey Club said no. The Owners and Trainers Association then organised a boycott of the New Year's Day meeting in 1902. All the owners withdrew from the race except for 2 or 3, which meant that if the races were run, the Jockey Club would have to pay out all the prize money, including all the promised added money, but would have got very little from the owners via acceptance fees. This led to the cancellation of that meeting and immediately led to Port Adelaide getting an extra day's racing. It also led, secondly, to a regulation passed by the Jockey Club saying that they could call off a meeting without default if there was a conspiracy to scratch runners. This led to another boycott by the Owners and Trainers Association and the threat of a third. At this stage, the Adelaide Racing Club stepped in and acted as a mediator and convinced the Owners and Trainers Association that they ought to back down and accept, quote, that there must be some body in the state which controls racing. And that was the last major challenge to the authority of the Jockey Club in the period that we're looking at. All the other disputes were over the race days allocated to the various clubs by the Jockey Club. And the main dispute was simply who got the public holidays. The whole thing got very confused when Queen Victoria died, because the Accession Day meeting and the Birthday meeting then changed the dates, and the clubs began to fight over who should have them. Obviously, a public holiday meant more money being paid at the gate, with more people likely to turn up. But there was never any real challenge to the Jockey Club over this, because the Jockey Club had the prime shot in its locker, could claim that the Adelaide Cup, the premier race meeting in South Australia, was never held at this time on a proclaimed public holiday. So the others really didn't have a strong case to argue that the Jockey Club was siphoning off the best days for itself. So that the control problem, I think, gets solved by the 1890s, really. Secondly, the number of horses. The average number of runners per race at metropolitan meetings, 1890 was 11, 1910 was 16. No problem there any more than in a shortage of horses. It's very interesting, of course, that the 2, 3 or 4 entries which caused the abandonment of racing during the dispute with the Owners and Trainers Association would have satisfied the race goers the race organisers half a century before. So the number of horses isn't a problem, and the prize money is no longer a problem. The tote commissions diminish seeking of prize money as a financial problem. See some of the figures there, but for individual meetings, the Adelaide Racing Club averaged in successive quinquennia per annum £6,000 via the tote, £6,200 via the tote. In the 5 last seasons there, they got £12,500 per annum from tote turnover. Gate money went up. There was an increase in the interest in race meetings. This can be seen, I think, if you look at the Adelaide Cup attendances in the last column there. But for ordinary meetings, South Australian Jockey Club averaged in the 1 quinquennium £4,500, £4,500, then in that last 5 years £7,000 a year coming in through the gate. So add that to 12,000 from the tote, you're not doing too badly financially. Result was that there was less required from the owners than before. Now, I should point out, the South Australian owners had never raised as much for their own money as did owners in England. The figures in England were around about 70% at this time. South Australia, before the tilt, it was about 30 to 35%. With the coming of the tilt in the last season dealt with there, owners of the Adelaide Adelaide Racing Club paid only 23% of the prize money, and at the South Australian Jockey Club only 19%. In other words, 81% of the prize money is coming from somewhere else than the owners themselves. Well, can we summarise then what I've been trying to argue today? In 3/4 of a century, I would argue that South Australian racing had changed substantially. By 1912, Adelaide boasted 3 permanent racecourses, Cheltenham, Morphettville and Victoria Park, which hosted 26 days racing a year, with 6 or more organised races on each card. It's a tremendous contrast to the heats and matches in that dusty paddock at Theberton 75 years before. Now, whether South Australian racing was yet an industry, I think is debatable. But certainly there was a higher degree of commercialisation within racing than at any time before. In 1912, South Australian horse racing offered a living to 184 trainers. It offered employment, I won't say a living, to 235 jockeys and several hundred stable lads. Moreover, it had spawned a breeding industry. Overseas exports of South Australian horses averaged £7,500 per annum in the first decade of the 20th century, and sales to other states averaged over £50,000 per annum. To this have got to be added all the sales that occurred within South Australia. Now we know that was about 2,500 at thoroughbred auction sales, but then there's an unknown quantity of private transactions and sales of half-bred stock. There'd also been a shift of the virtually parasitic relationship of gambling with racing to one of symbiosis. Racing and the totalisator flourished together. Tote turnover at metropolitan meetings in 1912-13 totaled £452,000, of which the racing clubs took 7.5%, or just under £34,000. Moreover, the state government also siphoned off 2.5%. Now, possibly I suspect that the introduction of a government tax on tote turnover in 1902 signals the recognition that racing had become a business. If there's profits to be made, the government comes in. Maybe that's the signal. 1902 is the key year in South Australian racing. What the contribution of racing to the South Australian economy is incalculable. But if any credence is given to the estimates made for the early 1880s, when metropolitan tote turnover was 85% less than in 1912, when prize money was 60% less than 1912, and when the number of days racing was 50% less than 1912, it must have been substantially above the £100,000 to £200,000 cited at that time. Clearly then, by 1912, the commercial aspects of South Australian racing stretched well beyond the refreshment tents. Thank you. South Australia had many corrupt people involved in racing, but they all came from Victoria. Or so the parliamentary debates of the totalisation. The blackguards of South Australia were all seen as the Melbourne bookmakers that would come in for the annual race, relieve all the poor innocent young men of South Australia of hard-earned money, then disappear back over the border. There are stories of races being rigged. My impression, that's all I can say, is in fact the great age of corruption in South Australian racing was in the interwar period, not in these early years. No, bookmakers initially were illegal because of the way the law of gambling worked. All gambling debts were debts of honour, but to gamble on certain events were illegal. So owners could wager against each other, but could not wager on a third party, which meant that bookmakers taking bets against everybody were illegal. And this changed by a decision in the British courts in 1844 following a major scandal in the British Derby, which was for 3-year-olds. It was won by a 5-year-old. Right? And gambling legislation was tightened up, and bookmaking as such didn't develop at the time, but people putting betting lists up in public houses did. They put a list up for a race that might be a big race occurring in 4 months' time. With odds, and landlords would take bets from it, and then the odds would be altered the next day, this sort of thing. You didn't get betting on the racetrack really until the 1870s. No, they tended and bet that way. As far as we can determine, it's very difficult. We'll only do it via court cases, hence the people that are caught out. Betting at the racetracks was not on horses until the 1860s. It was on things what we call even odd tables, a bit like two-up type of thing. You bet, did the ball stop in a red or a black type of thing. And it was on the three-card trick, and the thimble men, with 3 thimbles and a pea, and the shuffle them round. You have to guess which thimble the pea's under, and all the time it's under the fingernail of the man shuffling them round. It was that type of betting that went on. That's why people went and enjoyed the race meeting, but enjoyed non-race type betting. But gambling, I think, is what we're talking about. Gambling with bookmakers as opposed to making bets on the three-card trick. And that really developed late 60s, 70s. Really just, as John will, I think, support me, just sitting down and slogging your way through the press. And then secondly, the various race cards that are here enable you to look at the structure of racing and the number of runners per meeting, this sort of thing. It's just sheer heart slog is in the newspaper. Well, jockey, of course, in the old days, you didn't have professional jockeys, you used to have owner riders. And the professional jockey developed after. The jockey, as we know it, is a derivation of the original word jockey. But it's also worth noting that the other meaning of the word jockey is to cheat, if you look it up in the dictionary. But the jockeys themselves would never have been allowed to be members of the jockey club, that is, professional jockeys. In fact, you'll find, you read the jockey club minutes in the 1890s, tremendous influence that the jockey club have on jockeys' private lives. They employ detectives to follow the men around to see if they go into public houses and consort with women of ill repute. And then when they come up for the annual licence, he said, now, on 12th of June last year, you were seen with the why. If there's no satisfactory explanation, the bloke is thrown out of racing for a year. Very much old-fashioned paternalism. If you're good, you can get good money as a jockey, but if you're bad, you're out. I mean, it's their local meeting. If they can ride their horse to victory at their own meeting, then there's a lot of prestige attached to it. But you see, you're not talking about 6, 7 stone weights. You're talking about horses that carried 10, 12 stone over long distances. Yeah, but it just kept the old-fashioned name because that's how it had been in Britain from time immemorial. Well, in Britain it developed as the point-to-point race, and owner riders still race the national hunt type racing. But this didn't really go on in this. I mean, one of the big differences in racing in this country was there wasn't a close season, whereas in Britain you switched from the flat to the national hunt. You got very little of that here. So there wasn't a place for the owner rider at the end of the century, except occasionally, say, at the Oakbank meeting. I haven't, because this is part of a study on the economics of sport in South Australia. I made a little attempt to start on it. In fact, it's just impossible to get data. It just seemed to me that the picnic race, it still continues in South Australia even today. Most of the country racing was wiped out as legal racing by this regulation in 1891 of registered meetings. You had to provide a minimum amount of prize money, and the country meetings simply couldn't provide this amount of money, so they became unregistered meetings for unlicensed jockeys, unlicensed horses. It becomes a different type of racing altogether. Right, initially you've got the Tattersalls, you've also got the South Australian Licensed Victualers Racing Club, which again has a long history. They do set off, well, in fact, Licensed Victualers sets off during this period when the totes close down, and they take a chance of running legal meetings with illegal bookmakers. Tattersalls was essentially a betting man's club. Right? But when the tote comes in, again, the tote says there shall be no more than 7 days racing by any club in Adelaide. Now, if you want 26 days racing, right, and you've only got 3 major clubs, you can't do it. So you allow South Australian Tattersalls Club to have some days racing, you allow the licensed victualers, and they just hire the course at Morphettville or at Victoria Park from the Jockey Club or the Adelaide Racing Club. They become, in effect, just means of getting around the Totalisator Act and having more days racing than that would have allowed. But initially, one was a betting club and one was a genuinely a racing club. No, if you look at these cards, you find a lot of the racing meetings are in fact midweek. There was no advantage really to the weekend until the 1870s. Yeah, mainly what in fact I've got in this paper here is a breakdown of what horses were sold abroad. You can pick all this about the South Australian parliamentary papers, in fact, in very great detail. And it's very obvious when the army contracts come in. And from the press, I managed to trace who were getting some of the contracts, and they're definitely going to the people who are involved in the studs involved with racing. But again, as racing in Adelaide changed and you went more for sprint racing, then this is not the type of horse that was wanted by the Army. The Army wanted a horse that could carry a 10, 11 stone man long distances, not the horse that went 6 furlongs carrying a 7 stone jockey. And so there's a shift of the emphasis of the breeding industry away from the Army, I think, towards racing itself in the end. And it becomes a very incestuous relationship. You're breeding for the sake of the racing industry, not for the sake of horses elsewhere in the economy. Things like the Queen's Plate changed, and it became an award for stallion at the horse show, rather than for one that won a horse race.
Yes, the these horses that were bought for the remount, they were Brumley.
Yeah.
Bred on the station.
Nothing to do with racing at all.
Nothing to do with racing.
There was not a lot of opposition to racing per se. It was to gambling that the opposition focused. I think you said you read the thesis today, the Punters in Paradise thesis. And really the congregational ministers are the real lobby, the anti-racing lobby. But it's really gambling they're going, and then racing becomes so dependent on gambling that if gambling falls, so does racing. I've not found a lot of evidence. You always will get some people who will say it's cruel, etc. But the main thrust of the argument was always against the young men being led into poverty, the crime that results from servants stealing the master's money to bet on horses, this type of approach, not racing itself.